We are going to record this session, and I hope nobody has a problem with that. You do let us know.
Okay, I just pressed the record button.
Okay, Madhav is going to be co-hosting and taking care of all the Zoom problems.
Oh.
And Joe is going to explain exactly how the session's going to go. So I'll turn it over to Joe.
So I think most of the preliminaries have been there. So I'll just review the agenda. So first, any questions about Zoom stuff? Everybody okay? Good. So I'll give a presentation. During the presentation, I will have 2 pauses to give people an opportunity to ask a few questions. Basically, the reason I'm doing that is just to give me a break. I think just continuing to talk, I think, will be too much for me. So the questions will be a kind of a break. After I'm done, I'm going to review a handful of lessons that I learned along the way. I'll display them all, and we can look at each one and see if other people kind of agree with the lessons or not. And then we can talk about the lessons either to, modify them, get your opinions about those lessons. And then after that, if any people are so moved to share, not necessarily their story of white privilege, but just share an episode or 2 where maybe they have experienced white privilege from here's what I gained from it, here's what disadvantaged me. And again, some of us have had the experience of sometimes having the short end of the stick, sometimes having the long end of the stick. So if you can provide both experiences, that's fine. So that's just the intro. And at the end, we'll do a checkout. So it gives everybody a chance, maybe who hasn't spoke, to kind of at least articulate how they felt about the experience and what you learned. Questions, comments, or am I ready to go? Did I forget anything? Forget anything?
Huh?
Call from Vishal Gia.
Well, you can go.
Good, Diane's.
Call from Vishal Gia.
Okay, so I will start. So if everybody would mute now until we have opportunity for questions, that would be appreciated. So I will start. So some of you know that I'm not really very comfortable giving presentations beyond introducing and moderating a panel and letting the real speakers do the talking. So that's, but sometimes I am compelled to go beyond my comfort zone. Maybe I am called to do it. I just feel the need to do it. And I guess this is one of those occasions. And to help me overcome some of my own discomfort, and I'm imagining that we're all sitting around a nice table having dinner and relaxing together. So again, each of you may enjoy your favorite munchie, assuming you're on mute, and your favorite beverage. I decided to just stick with the water, even though I had fantasies about having a beer, but I opted not to. And for those of you who responded to my angst, encouraging emails, I appreciate that. It helped me, it just helped. We'll leave it at that. Okay, so I will start. So my name is Joe Ritacco, and this is my story. My motivation for this effort was first to learn about white privilege, a concept that at best was fuzzy in my mind. But behind that, I really had the question of like, gee, have I benefited from white privilege? I kind of suspected I did, but to tell you the truth, if somebody asked me, I went, I don't know. Now I know. I will start by sharing what I was taught and what I wasn't taught as a child. And then what I learned later in life, and even what I just learned, I'll say, in the last few months. So the learning doesn't end. So this is meant to be a story. So it will not be overly analytical or wonky. Sometimes I do that, but not tonight. So let me start with a basic assertion that is probably obvious. Most adult white Americans are basically clueless about white privilege and institutional racism. So ignorance abounds. And this ignorance often leads to a blaming of the victim. My understanding of white privilege now is that it's not about guilting whites for the sins of America, because most of us as individuals and even our immediate family, we're not complicit in the creation of the unjust systems and often are just plain unaware. Rather, it's important to have white Americans become aware of the benefits that they have achieved for white privilege and let them know that they can use their white privilege to help make things better. So that's it. It's about using your privilege in a good way, not saying it was bad that you had it. Of course, the prerequisites for getting people to use their privilege to change things is they have to be aware that there are unjust systems. And may my story and similar stories help people understand. So my story will be told roughly in chronological chapters. Along the way, I will explicitly mention some lessons that I learned along the way. First, about racism within individuals. Later in life, about institutional racism. And again, only recently, about white privilege. More lessons. After the presentation, I will review each of these lessons one at a time to get your reaction to those lessons, whether you think they're right, whether you disagree, and we can talk about that. After the first two chapters, which are my longer ones, I will open up the floor for questions, just a couple, again, just to give me a break. And let's not talk about the lessons learned then, we'll save that for later. And after the presentation and dialogue, if others are moved to share an episode or two from their life about white privilege, whether it helped them, whether it disadvantaged them, or did both, you'll be given the opportunity to do that. If we choose to turn this into a public event, my presentation will be much shorter. Okay, I will again seek partners in the presentation. And just so you know, in late October, I've already committed to do a presentation to the Presbyterian churches of Monmouth County, and I plan to try to recruit people from within my church community to share the panel with me. And as this is an unrehearsed and unreviewed presentation, feel free to take notes about things you think I could do better or different or shorten. If you think it's worth sharing at the end of value to everybody, do that. Otherwise, my guess is it's just better to send me an email, give me a call, and I'll take your inputs to heart. As I said, this presentation was longer than I originally thought, so it will be probably about 45 minutes, which is, I thought, was shocking when I realized it. But I am a slow talker, and I will intersperse some photos and graphics to make it a little more interesting. So, story starts for my family about 100 years ago when my grandparents came to America from Southern Italy for economic opportunity. My grandfathers were laborers, semi-literate or semi-literate at best, and had virtually no education. Their children all managed to get through high school and all ended up with steady jobs. So that was like a big step between that generation and ours. Now, my nuclear family was of modest means. I would suggest that we were somewhere between working class and lower middle class. So again, there was some progress there. This leads to one ideal of the American dream, namely that parents would sacrifice and work hard so that their kids would be better off. This indeed worked in my family for 2 generations. But I believe this dream is not working so well anymore in America, and it has never, ever been nearly as realistic for Blacks in America. So what did I learn from my family about race and how to treat other people? My father was a man of few words. So when he spoke, it was time to listen up. He told this story on several occasions. When his father first came to America and got off the boat, he had a note in his hand with an address. Turns out the first person that he bumped into was a Black man. The Black man, he couldn't speak English, so the Black man looked at the note and basically escorted my grandfather to his destination. The moral of the story, as my father describes it, is he said, you can't judge people by their color, their ethnicity, or their religion. There are good eggs and bad eggs and all sorts of eggs in every basket. So, graphic number 1, hopefully you can see it. That's Mom and Dad Ritacco, Mary and Emil. I guess you can't see it very well, I'm sorry. But they deserve to be front and center in the story, because one of the key reasons I believe I have the tolerance I have is that, you know, what I learned from my parents. So that's so lesson number 1, obvious, is what you were taught by your parents and your nuclear family about those who are different from you has a huge impact on attitudes of kids. Individual racism is learned. We are not born with it. So let me tell you a little about the demographic profile of my neighborhood. I grew up in Flatbush, which is the geographic center of Brooklyn. I attended public schools, even though most of my neighborhood friends went to Catholic school. Oops. My block, okay. So where I went to public school, I had a very different demographic group there than my neighborhood. My typical public school was 90% Jewish, a few Catholics, and a few Blacks. So I had many Jewish friends. I liked some, I didn't like some, very consistent with lesson number 1 from my parents. When I was about 10 years old, we moved, and the first person in my new school who intentionally befriended me was Carlos, a black-skinned Puerto Rican. Carlos and I were closest friends for years. I am thankful for this friendship as evidence that cross-racial friendships can indeed just plain exist like any other. So lesson number 2 that I've shared with some of you at McRET before is that I believe that integrated diverse schools are an important factor in creating a less biased society. I will infer a lesson from my experience that once you learn to be comfortable with one group that is different, it is easy to apply this attitude to other groups that you may encounter later in life. So let me show you this is my 6th grade graduation class.
Joe, if everyone wants to see that closer, they should put it on speaker view up at the upper right corner.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, thank you. Everybody go to speaker view. Maybe I should do that too, so I can see what people are saying. So again, not great, but the 2 kids on the lower left and right, Carlos is at one end and I'm at the other end, with the 2 smallest kids in the class. There's one other black girl in the class. So that's again a typical class of mine, mostly Jewish kids, a couple of Blacks and a couple of Catholics. Okay. So as evidence that we were really best of friends, this is, for those who know public schools, they gave out these little books and people would sign them and say silly things. So this was my 6th grade one. And I pulled out the page that says, among other things, best chums, Carlos Candelario and Phyllis and Philip Licitra. So evidence that Carlos and I really were best of friends, not just my imagination. So now let me shift back to the other half of my demographic life, the block that I lived on, which is pretty typical for Brooklyn. End to end, it's about 1/10 of a mile long and includes about 200, mostly 2-family homes and 1 small apartment building. This nets out to be about 1,000 people. So a lot of people on 1 block. So it was a place where people walked. We didn't have cars. There was not a lot of air conditioning. So a lot of interaction on the block. I'll show you a photo of the block. I don't know if you can see it, but again, the houses are all right next to each other. And yes, that's me in my brand new used car in 1965, which I had to buy in order to start my job at Bell Labs in the suburbs of New Jersey. So a little other personal history in there. Most of the families on my block were ethnic Europeans from about 10 different European countries, and most were Roman Catholic. There were a few Jewish families, including one who rented the apartment above my home from my parents. There were no blacks living on my block. And in contrast to my public school, the local Catholic school certainly had no Jews and few, if any, blacks. So my neighborhood Catholic friends did not have exposure to Jews or blacks in their neighborhood or at their school. And sadly, anti-Semitism was actually promoted by some of the Catholic teachers. For example, emphasizing that Jews killed Christ was a powerful message. I tried to counter this by sharing my experience with Jewish friends, but to little avail. My 2 demographic communities, school and neighborhood, did not interact. Occasionally, I would have a Jewish friend over my house to work on a school project. This did not have any repercussions as no one noticed. However, after I visited my friend Carlos's home and was treated to his mother's delicious corn pone, I wanted to reciprocate. So I told my parents I wanted to have Carlos over to the house. My parents' reaction was not what I expected. They said, "It's okay with us. What will the neighbors say?" I was angry, and I challenged them for not practicing what they preached. They relented. Carlos visited, and he was warmly welcomed in my home. But as predicted, our neighbors did raise a fuss with my parents. By the way, I just reviewed this memory for accuracy with my almost 98-year-old mom, and she too vividly remembers this experience. Sad to say, most of my neighborhood friends indeed did grow up as avowed bigots. I suspect their family lessons were not like mine. As I said, they had minimal cross-cultural relationships. So they experienced the flip side of my experience. This leads to the corollary to the lessons shared so far. Namely, if as a child you learn from your family and or schools to be biased against some groups, it is very natural to become xenophobic and be bigoted against even those who have not been part of your world. In particular, it was easy, I would say natural, for most of my friends to become Islamophobes when the opportunity presented itself years later. This is more than idle speculation. I know this as we continue to be close friends in spite of this large attitudinal gap. So that's kind of my story, a little bit about racism at the individual level as a kid. So what about privilege? Growing up, I didn't believe I had any. My belief then was class, economic class was what gave you privilege, and privilege gave you connections. And when I was looking for summer jobs as a teen, I quickly learned that the best way to get a summer job, maybe the only way, was through who you knew. My dad looked at me and says, I don't have any connections. I don't know anybody. So I got mostly menial jobs in the neighborhood, like delivery boy. So privilege, couldn't imagine it. I will only briefly touch on my college years, 1961 to 1965. I attended the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, which I hopped on the subway for 15 cents and took me about an hour to get there. It may sound strange given the era of the 1960s, this was 1961 to 5, but for me, this was a time and place of political apathy. My school had precisely one protest in the 4 years that I attended, and that was because the tuition doubled during that period. The anti-Vietnam and civil rights movement had not yet arrived in my world. So my ignorance of deeper issues of institutional racism continued through college. So I'll take a break now. Any questions, comments at this point? I'll take a sip. Okay.
You're doing good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I
good.
have a question, Joe. I have a quick question.
Sure.
You were talking about your friends who did not have exposure to other diverse folks and how they were, how can you say, you said they became Islamophobic and so on. You and I worked at AT&T Bell Labs, and that was like the United Nations. It truly was.
Mm-hmm.
Were these people professional? Did they grow up to become professional? Did they work with other people from other nations? And the reason I asked that was when I came out of Bell Labs, I was shocked out of my shell. Because for the first time after about 15, 17 years, if I was working with the likes of builders and real estate people, I mean, that was the pits. It was like I had come from Mars. When I went into lawyering around the same time, you know, once I opened my mouth and about 5 minutes into it, it was fine. They would just sort of, you know, relax. But up until then, again, it was like, who is this person? And even now, it's a very strange world. It's like as if they work in some kind of a balloon.
Well, I'll say most of my friends, I'll say half of them ended up as policemen, firemen, sanitation men, postmen. So that's half of it. The ones that, some were professionals on Wall Street, but that didn't help a lot. And there were a handful of exceptions to that too. But again, I think it was mostly due to their exposure as kids. And I think their professional life didn't turn it around. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question.
Hey, Joe, can I say something?
Please.
In response to Belvinder, Robert and I worked at AT&T and Bell Labs for many years, just focused on issues of diversity. And so I heard lots and lots of people's stories. And I could tell you racism was alive and well. A lot of prejudice was alive and well. I mean, people stayed in their professional, you know, boxes when they had to work professionally. But we didn't only do workshops. We did things like exit interviews. And you know, we really got our ears full.
Wow.
Right, you got
Surprise.
behind the curtain, if you will.
Behind the
Yeah, okay.
curtain, yep. Not that people behaved
Right, right.
correctly that way, but yeah, there was a lot of stuff. Chinese, whole Chinese groups of people felt like they were disenfranchised,
Right,
things
right.
like that.
So let me end, if you find it.
Can I say something? It's Georgette.
Oh, yeah, please.
Do I have to raise my hand? Can you
No,
hear
no,
me?
go ahead. Go ahead,
ahead.
speak. Go ahead, George. So somebody is. Radio on.
Can you hear me? I can't hear
Do
anybody.
you have a radio on? Somebody has a radio on. I see everybody is muted except Joe, myself, and George. Georgette, maybe she has the radio on. Okay, Georgette. Okay.
I think Georgette gave up. Okay, so I forgot to say one thing. So each of these chapters I call.
Georgette's still trying to talk, but she's muted.
Yeah,
Am I better now?
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yes, yes.
With us. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So can everybody hear me?
But we also hear
I
some
just
background
can't hear
noise.
anybody else.
We also hear background noise, Georgette.
You always know that you could be back to this movie.
I'm trying, but I can't hear anybody.
Oh,
We can hear you though.
we
And
I
we
can
can
wonder if
hear,
this is an
and we can hear a
intruder.
television or something in your background too.
Yeah.
You're muted again, Georgette.
Well, maybe we'll just come back to Georgette later.
yeah, I think let's
If we don't
do
mind.
that.
So I forgot to say that each of my chapters starts out with a title, and the first one was Blessed to Have Good Beginnings. And the second chapter, which we're going to do now, is to say Blessed to Have Worked at a company that allowed me to use my caring side. So, and this is the Bell Labs story, of course. So upon graduation, I was lucky, and lucky is the right word, to get a job at Bell Laboratories, where I worked for over 30 years. As implied earlier, the American dream for my family was again accomplished. I was the first in a very large extended family to graduate from college, and the salary that I earned in the first year actually was more than my dad was making at the time. My family was proud and satisfied. When affirmative action was introduced just a few years later, I immediately volunteered to be part of what was called an affirmative action committee. We had an open-ended charter to make affirmative action happy. This was very exciting for me. I transferred a number of times in Bell Laboratories, but I probably was an active affirmative action committee member for probably 20 years. I did it first as a non-manager and then as a manager. I cared about the issues, and I was really pleased that I was allowed to basically not only do something about the caring, but even get rewarded for it, or at least not punished for it. Maybe I'll look at it that way. I believe affirmative action worked at Bell Labs. Bell Labs values creativity and innovation, which was brought into the domain of AA. It was not enough for one of us to analyze the data, which we did, of course, and say that X% of engineers in colleges are Black or women, and our demographics are already better than that. So we're doing okay, right? No, not acceptable. More radical thinking was called upon if we wanted to create systemic change. So we needed to get closer to the roots of the problem. So basically, we actually changed our recruiting practices, went to places we never gone before, created, I wouldn't say we had great success in terms of numbers, but we did institute some programs that I think had lasting effect. We introduced the program, Bring Your Daughter to Work Day, which I believe may still be happening, or at least it did a few years ago. The AA effort, in my opinion, at Bell Labs was sincere and sustained. Not universal, but at least in my parts of the world. And I could say that, I put my oar in there, so that probably helped a little bit. We didn't have great luck increasing numbers, but I can say that individual behavior and attitudes improved significantly where I was. We were taught that we all suffer from implicit bias. For example, there was definitely a bias towards white males as the model engineer. I was a math major and I was even discriminated against, like somehow I didn't measure up. And I remember challenging one of my good friends and he says, "Oh, Joe, you're okay. You think like an engineer." Yeah. So that was their throwing the bone, right? So we learned that there was a bias there. If there was a bias towards white males, there would be logically an implicit bias against others, women in particular, blacks, of course. But since we were taught now that we had this implicit bias, we were collectively asked to challenge each other if we saw like stuff happening unconsciously that came to the surface. In particular, our performance reviews, we really looked extra hard to look at the distribution of women and blacks in the ladder and make sure that things didn't just look wrong. And we took second looks at anything and challenged each other to say, "Are you sure about that, or is that just our bias coming through?" So I saw a positive change. And in a recent book that I just read, So You Want to Talk About Race, by Ijeoma Oluo, he argues that affirmative action is useful because it works. It doesn't work wonders, but helps to move society towards appreciating equality and diversity. Very consistent with my first-hand experience. One not so obvious effect of affirmative action was that managers, technical managers, got exposed to sensitivity training, which was sorely needed. I strongly believe that Bell Laboratories managers became better people managers from this training. I know that I learned a lot of useful techniques. So another thing to look at. I've written maybe 2 or 3 poems in my life. I'll read this one to you, but this was kind of a diversity day event that we all had to do something, and I wrote this little poetic kind of thing. It's called The Bountiful Garden. For a beautiful garden, one must cultivate a variety of flowers. So that implies that diversity is beautiful. But for a flourishing garden, one must tend to each flower in its own way, which implies that if you're going to have diversity, you're going to have to learn that people are different. You're going to have to learn about the sensitivities of people from different cultures. I also argue that once you start doing that, you start becoming more sensitive to the needs of individuals, just because you start thinking differently. I will also add that the artwork is from my wife. So thank you. So I will now share a memorable experience as an affirmative action advocate. We started touching on this earlier. I attended a multi-day urban minority workshop in Newark. The workshop was led by a very commanding Black man, Mr. Harvey. Not sure if I can remember his first name. Most of the participants were managers, the one I attended, and all were white. They were required to attend. I was not a manager at the time, but attended due to my role as an affirmative action committee volunteer. One exercise that Mr. Harvey led required that each attendee openly state, "I am a racist." Needless to say, this was very uncomfortable. And personally, as an AA advocate working to combat racism, why would one want to label me as a racist, potentially alienating me in the process? So when it was my turn to speak, I basically said exactly that. The argument was not accepted. But he kept going around the room, and he said, no one is leaving this room until each of you admits that you are a racist. One by one, attendees relented. My personal belief is that most of the managers were simply telling him what he wanted to hear in order to end the torture and to get out of the room. It felt to me, though, that he was taking special delight in seeing me squirm. At one point, he confronted me directly as follows. Joe, you're single, right? Yes. So he posed this question. He says, if you're at a party and there's this cute white girl over here and there's this cute available black girl over here, who are you going to talk to? I said, I probably would go talk to the white girl. Case closed, Joe. You are a racist. I gave up. I conceded. I said something like, if any shred of bias towards whites makes me a racist, then I admit I am a racist. But of course, this was not my definition of the term racist, which was a very pejorative term. To this day, I question the wisdom of browbeating people into guilt and submission. I think that's what he thought was the right approach to shake people up. My understanding about the book, the recent book, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, I think uses similar techniques. I have not read the book, and I have decided I don't think I want to read the book for that reason. So this is not an approach that I would ever use, but I still struggle with this. Is there a lesson here? One lesson might be that there are many ways of getting people to change. So maybe that approach works for him, and maybe that approach would work on some people. And maybe other approaches might work for other people, and I would certainly use other approaches. Or maybe I didn't learn the deeper lesson. Maybe this was an example of white fragility on my part. So that question is still kind of unanswered for me. I forgot to say this, but my work in affirmative action kind of got me exposed to some of the ills of our society. And ultimately, I was starting to question, why in heaven's name am I working at Bell Labs doing this techie stuff, which is having no positive impact on the ills of society, racism, poverty, the ills of cities, which are issues that I still care about. So I considered quitting a few times. But one thing I did do is I took classes at the new school in Greenwich Village, which is a very, very progressive school. I ended up earning a certificate in urban planning. For what end, I did not know, but that was like the thing that I chose to do. One memorable course that I took in 1975 was entitled Black Power and White Politics. It was taught by none other than Shirley Chisholm, who was one of the people featured in Ellen's story. She was our first Black congresswoman, and she was from Brooklyn, if I recall, in 1968. And she was the first Black presidential candidate for a major party in 1972. She was a giant of a person in a tiny body. She had a big impact on me. To earn the certificate of urban planning at the new school, I had to take about 10 courses and write a thesis-like report, which I finally got done in 1976. I squirreled around my attic recently, and I did find a copy. I imagine I would. This was 100 pages with 40 references. This is the closest thing to a book that I will probably ever write. But boy, did I learn a lot. The report was titled, this is a mouthful, The Dynamics of Sustained Poverty Within Urban America. It included a large focus on one question that I personally wanted to better understand. Namely, why did it seem more difficult for Blacks to enjoy the same intergenerational economic improvements as immigrant families like mine? In my introduction, after I did some research, I asserted that most ethnic European immigrants who struggled to make it in America were indeed familiar with many of the challenges faced by Blacks. However, they were not at all aware of the differences. My thesis of the primary differences was primarily twofold. First, the growth of the economy has slowed down, so there was less economic pie per capita to divvy up. American boats were just not rising as much anymore. But the second and more compelling factor was that some boats were not rising nearly as much or not at all due to the forces of systemic racism. So this research was when I learned about the extent of institutional racism, including government policies that sustained segregated neighborhoods, which led to segregated schools, which led to other disadvantages, ultimately resulting in greatly diminished opportunity. One of the cornerstone documents that I relied on was the 1968 federal report, the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, commonly known as the Kerner Commission report. I'm curious to know if anybody has ever heard of that or is familiar with that. Okay, couple, that's kind of what I thought. The impetus for this report was to analyze the urban riots of the summer of 1967. Objectives of the report included: first, what triggered the events? Second, an in-depth analysis of the underlying causes for the, not just what happened 2 weeks before, but what were the underlying causes. And three, even laying out a broad range of possible solutions. Two quotes stand out from the report. One, this is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Second quote, what white Americans have never fully quite understood, but that Negroes can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. It was not too many months later that my life took a totally unpredicted turn that disrupted whatever murky path I was on. So this will be an opportunity for a few more questions. Good, I'll take a sip.
Joe,
Christine?
you said, let me find where I made my little note here. That you learned that government policies maintained segregated neighborhoods. Can you expand on that?
I will come back to that later.
Okay.
Val?
What was the name of the report? I'm sorry, I'd like to read it. The Kerwin report. Could you give me something a little bit more so that I can easily
Yes.
search it?
So I will send out a list of references that will be in there.
Wonderful.
One
Thank
page.
you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. So chapter 3, more blessings, but new directions. The next phase of my life, starting in the late 1970s when I was in my early 30s, started with a 2-year totally unexpected work assignment in Tehran, Iran. That was my first encounter with Muslims and a culture quite different than anything I had ever experienced. An intense cultural immersion indeed. I believe that my public school experience with diversity, modest as it was, served me well. I adapted better than most of my American coworkers. In 1979, shortly after an abrupt return to the USA due to the Iranian Revolution, I met my wife, Sue, got promoted, bought my first home, had 2 children, and became churched again after at least a 15-year absence. I promised Sue that I would give church a try. She was a lifelong Christian Presbyterian and believed that if the father doesn't think church is important, then the kids will not. So I told her I would give it a try. As it turns out, I am much better suited to be a Presbyterian than to be a Roman Catholic. The Presbyterian approach is very democratic and participatory. Aside, I believe the U.S. government is actually modeled after Presbyterian polity. So decisions about budgets, priorities, and programs are made by ordained elders who are lay people who are nominated and elected by church members. My wife and I each served the maximum of 6 consecutive years as elder, first her and then me. So in short, lots of my time and energy of raising my family in a crazy work life was centered around my new family and church. I gravitated to my church's mission commission. It focuses on helping those in need in the local community and beyond. I've now been a member of this commission for about 25 years. My interest in peacemaking was deepened as I learned more about the issues of Northern Ireland from a missionary. I was very involved with our refugee resettlement program, mostly helping my wife, who was one of the project leaders. We became very close friends with 2 families from the former Yugoslavia. We continue to be friends. I really want to understand better how lifelong friends and neighbors could become deadly foes. I learned that in spite of media hype, it was not about religion, as Yugoslavia was a communist nation and for 50 years religion was virtually banned. So there were no really religious people at the time. But the conflict was stoked by ambitious political leaders using age-old religious and ethnic animosities. Religion was not the cause, but became a useful factor in defining us versus them. I learned to dismay that trying to address issues of social justice were at best not of interest in my church. Concerns were too controversial, divisive, too political, etc. I just read Debbie Irving's book, Waking Up White, which is about white privilege, but she basically explains clearly the cultural norms of Northern American mainline Protestants. She refers to them as WASPs, a pejorative term to some, but she uses it, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In a chapter entitled The Culture of Niceness, she says, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything.
Mhm.
Avoid negative emotions. Don't show anger or disapproval. Avoid conflict. Don't discuss sensitive topics. So in short, in this particular culture, it's more important to play nice than redress injustice. which indeed can make people feel uncomfortable. So my church, not uniquely, is not fertile ground for challenging the status quo. However, the Presbyterian Church USA at the national level tends to have very progressive leadership. They have the power of the influence, but they do not have the power of the vote. So occasionally I do stuff at the national level for them. And also on the positive side, my congregation is relatively diverse for around here. About 10% of my congregation is Black, and it has been that way for at least 30 years. Our Black members represent a heterogeneous mix, some longtime locals and immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. And many Blacks have served as elected elders and deacons. I would not have joined a church if it was not open to diversity, especially if it was not welcoming to Blacks. Okay, so now we're at, make sure we've got chapter 5. Before looking ahead, I'll look back on my white privilege. So this is kind of where it gets a little more personal, a little more interesting. When I read a recent email sent by Stevie that had this list of 40 to 50 privileges that whites in America have relative to people of color, I was jolted. After reviewing the list the second time, I started checking things off. I quit counting after 20 or so. This was indeed an epiphany. And this was really what led me to learn what this white privilege thing was all about. And maybe it did play a role in my life, which at one time I had denied. Rather than providing a rigorous definition of white privilege, which I might normally do, I think it's more important to try to convey what it's like. For starters, these privileges just seem normal to those who have them, like a fish is not aware of the sea in which it swims. A better analogy that I just came across might be a stream with a strong current. Those with privilege are going happily along with the flow, and those without it have to struggle to fight against the same current. And Peggy McIntosh, who is the creator of this aforementioned list, describes her privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I am oblivious to, but I cash in every day. I repeat, unearned and oblivious. Very powerful. I will touch on two different manifestations of white privilege as I perceive them. There is indeed overlap between these two perspectives, but I'll just leave it at that. It's worth pointing out that the two authors that I will be relying upon both admitted total blindness to their privilege for many years, even though their work brought them in touch with Blacks. And these were two very well-intentioned, nice people. As I said earlier, right attitude does not imply awareness of institutional racism or white privilege. It needs to be learned, so it needs to be taught. The first perspective of white privilege is that knapsack full of invisible privileges carried around by whites. This was an essay written 30 years ago by Peggy McIntosh. I totally missed it, so I thank you, Stevie. This list, I would say, is mostly about advantages that whites experience daily as part of a white-centric American culture. And these advantages are not enjoyed by Blacks. The swimming downstream versus upstream metaphor applies well. Let me just share two of her examples. I can go shopping in an upscale store and not expect to be followed or harassed. I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism and the risk it implies for their physical safety. The list goes on and on. It includes many examples of issues that would cause daily emotional discomfort and even danger. I found it exhausting to even think about the implications of this long list. I gained an even deeper appreciation of the frequency and negative impact of the flip side of these privileges from the book Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. The book is written as a long letter to his Black son. Things he helps clarify to his son, feeling he needs to convey this. I am afraid. No one survives unscathed. We are forced to drink our own travesties and then smile about it. And lastly, make no mistakes. I mean, this was just chilling. The second manifestation of white privilege is portrayed in a recent book, Waking Up White, which I have an extra copy if somebody wants it, by Debbie Irving. This is more focused on the issues of institutional and systemic racism and privilege. Again, most white Americans are just plain unaware. Now that I understand this, I will offer one example how white privilege of the institutional kind helped my clueless family in a major way. I earlier described the demographics of my whites-only block. I certainly knew that there was discrimination by individuals, and that was a factor relative to segregation. But Brooklyn was well known to have ethnic neighborhoods such as Jewish, Italian, and Black neighborhoods. So I thought much of this was by choice. Living in an Italian neighborhood would increase the chance of having good Italian groceries nearby. And it's quite natural to want to live somewhere among people you are like. This is referred to as de facto discrimination towards one's own kind. It's described in another book I read in the 70s, Beyond the Melting Pot by Glazer and Moynihan. That will also be in the references. But for Blacks, there was more to it than preference on their part and more than individual bigotry against Blacks. There was also legalized de jure segregation. One policy was known as redlining. This made it difficult for Blacks to get a decent mortgage rate in their own redlined neighborhoods, and almost impossible to get mortgages in white neighborhoods. I just out of curiosity decided to go say, gee, I wonder what redlining was like in Brooklyn, because I really never knew that. So you're probably not going to be able to see this well. My apologies again if you're on, but you can see there's a huge red area in one part of Brooklyn, and I think Diane will be familiar with that neighborhood. I believe she's in there somewhere. But interestingly enough, there's a little red dot. There was a little black neighborhood like near where I lived. And I blew up that little red dot, and I says, lo and behold, that's where Carlos lived. So even that little black neighborhood near me was a red line neighborhood as opposed to a neighborhood that Blacks just chose to live. So that really made it crystal clear to me that this policy existed right in my neighborhood. Diane? Whoops, unmute, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, when I and my family, we moved in 1963. So I guess just before 65, I moved on New York Avenue between Snyder and Tilden, and I took the Church Avenue bus. I go way back with you before there ever was a King's Plaza. People don't even know that there used to not be King's Plaza. But I remember when I moved on New York Avenue in 63, and we were and like you said, there was one big apartment house, and there were other two family houses, and across the street was a public school. And when I moved on the block in my apartment building, we were the only, other than the super who lived in the basement, we were the only Black people. And when I first moved, I was an only child, so I had every single toy there was, and everybody was Jewish. And all of the kids played with me, and I had Etch-a-Sketch. I had, for all of us who go back to Tam, not just Barbie, but there was another one called Tammy. I had Barbie. I had all these toys, and everybody played with me. And and my mother said, "You're not taking all your toys outside," but we played. And then the following day when I came back out, nobody wanted to play with me anymore. And I asked them, why can't they play with me? And at first they said, we can't tell you. And then one of them said to us, they told us we can't play with you because you're colored. And I went upstairs and I said it to my mother. I said, they won't play with me. And she said, that's okay, and whatever. We did Etch-a-Sketch together. But when we moved on the block in 63, on New York between Snyder and Tilden, it was just like you described in the early 60s. So I don't know when, because it certainly is not that anymore.
Right. Curiously, you lived around the corner for me for 2 years. I lived on East 32nd Street between Tilden and Snyder.
So then we know the Church Avenue bus.
Sure, right, okay. So we were neighbors for 2 years. That's so great. So let me say that. So let me now go back to my family. When we bought our first home, a two-family house, we certainly were not constrained by policy or attitude as to where we chose to live. We were only limited by what we could afford. And ownership of a two-family house was a known ticket into the middle class. Once the mortgage was paid off, rent from the upstairs apartment would become a source of surplus income. And the sale of our family home has allowed my mom to enjoy more than 10 years in an assisted living community. So again, I started thinking back, well, let's see, 55, father bought house. Gee, I wonder if he took advantage of the GI Bill. I kind of didn't really know. So I checked with my mom. She says, yeah, the GI Bill, we used it because my dad did fight in World War II. What I also learned recently from Debbie Irving's book was that the GI Bill was not available to most Black veterans. I mean, I took it for granted the GI Bill was for any American soldier. But most Black veterans, in her words, were largely excluded due to discriminatory housing policies. Debbie Irving describes the GI Bill as affirmative action for white people. So I now know that my family cluelessly reaped a major economic uplift due to institutional white privilege. Can't deny it anymore. So chapter 6, blessed to be part of the Mama Center and connected to other groups to make America a more just and equal society. So this brings us to now, the year 2020. This has indeed been a year of upheaval in many dimensions in this country. The good news is that such discontinuities can be opportunities for change. Clearly, the killing of George Floyd and many other Blacks at the hands of our police has shaken up complacency on the part of many whites. The issues of institutional racism and white privilege have become front and center for many, Monmouth Center and me included. So it would be time for me to put on my Black Lives Matter pin, which I have here, but it got buried in my paper somewhere. I'm sorry. So this is my closing. Let me recap. Most whites in America are just plain not aware of white privilege and institutional racism. We can surely help with this education. And as we do this, it is important to pay attention to the wisdom offered by Peggy McIntosh. The intent is not to cast blame or lay guilt trip on whites who are alive now, but rather to get them to use their white privilege to make things better. A similar sentiment is offered in a recent New York Times article entitled America's Enduring Caste System, also in my references. Let me paraphrase. We live in an inherited house that on the outside appears to be beautiful, but the foundation is rotten and unstable. Many say that we had nothing to do with creating this. This may be true, but the house is for us to deal with now. Inaction on our part will only lead to further deterioration. The foundation will not fix itself. Complacency and denial can easily set in. When you live in an old house, it can become easy over time to become accustomed to its flaws, and they may be deemed too difficult or expensive to fix. And over time, what would be considered unacceptable once can become normal. But someday, if not addressed, this damn house may just indeed collapse. In my less poetic manner, once one knows the truth about injustices, one can choose to act or do nothing. So you're either part of the solution or you are part of the problem of sustaining unjust systems. Lastly, as I was writing this paper, it was interesting to me and admittedly painful to compare what I learned in the 1970s with the situation today. I reread the executive summary of the Kerner Commission report. If you replace the terms Black for Negro and Black Lives Matter for Black Power, the report sounds much too much like a description of today. For example, the top 3 grievances expressed by the Black community in 1968 were 1, police practices, 2, unemployment and underemployment, and 3, inadequate housing. And as I was writing this, a New York Times editorial was published that highlighted the same Kerner report and bemoaned the lack of resultant action, warning that this has become a recurring theme in America. We take a deep, pained assessment after things get bad, but then there is not much sustained action or fundamental change. I also reviewed the paper that I wrote in 1976. 2 of the subtitle headings in my conclusion were, without awareness that there can be no change. 2, how long can we afford to wait? So what shall it be this time, folks? And in closing, the words of James Baldwin are appropriate. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Let us do our part to face this challenge. Thank you. So,
Thank you, Joe.
okay. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me
That's
take
really excellent, Joe.
Oh, thank you. So let me take a deep breath. Well, I think you folks kind of helped uplift me to do this because it was heavy, and I usually kind of run out of gas after 5 minutes, but but I think thank you for helping me.
First of all, if we can all unmute so we can applaud this.
Okay, right. Or you can do the
Just
what I recently
Oh, no.
learned, jazz hands, if you would. So
Sorry I came in the end, Joe. Sorry, I had to celebrate my wife's birthday today.
all right. Well, it will be recorded. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Let me see.
So it's recorded. How can I see the recording?
I'll send it out, the link out in a day or 2. Okay.
Okay.
So what I'd like to do now is explicitly go through each of the lessons that I listed along the way and get your reaction to them if I can figure out how to do this. So let's say, so I want to go to, have to do this. And now if I share a screen, whoops. Oops, wrong one.
Okay.
Okay, good, lessons, okay. So there were, can people see that, by the way? Can people?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay,
Yes.
so here's the process. I'm gonna go through, I think, seven lessons one at a time and just get a quick vote. Don't struggle with it too much to see if you agree or disagree with the lesson or you're not sure.
There's some kind of Twilight Zone-y thing happening with the audio. Does anyone else hear that? Yeah.
I did for a second. Can everybody mute then? Until,
I think it's an echo that usually happens if some people are unmuted.
It actually sounds like whale talk.
There's a lot of people unmuted.
well, actually, let me, let's see, 8:15. So at about 8:30, I guess, Madhav, if you give me a heads up, so let me go through this quickly. We don't have as much time as I thought. So I'm going to just read the first two lessons as a couplet and just see if there's any reactions. So these are probably pretty simple, so I'm going to imagine not that interesting to talk about. But so lesson 1, attitudes, words, and actions of parents and other close relatives about those who are different has profound impact on children. So that was lesson 1, learned from my parents. Integrated, diverse public schools is an important factor in creating a less biased society. I guess together, I see these as, that individual racism is learned and not inborn. Any comments on that, or are these just too obvious to?
Joe, these aren't being shown on your share screen. What you read was not shown.
Oh.
You have identity descriptors on the screen, Joe. The 3 broad scenarios about identity. Can I just say something about your question in the meantime while you're fixing that? I remember about the very early days, the importance and what you learn. I'm remembering in South Pacific, there's a whole song, you've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to hate. And, at first, the romantic lead is not going to, she has questions because the children are mixed race or something like that. And then there's another instance. So that is actually something that people don't think of so much when they think of South Pacific as being just a happy talk. It's got a real good message in there.
I remember when I first heard that song, how powerful I thought it was.
Yeah.
It said it extremely clearly, I thought.
You've got to be careful. And then I think there's a lot of inadvertent being taught too.
Yeah, I'm grateful that I was not aware of. I have one particular aunt and uncle that are bigoted, and I'm glad I was not aware of their opinions when I was young. somehow they managed to not say too much in front of us, I guess. But now my sister picked up on something when she was young, because she actually vacationed with them one time. But I am grateful for my family of origin, my nuclear family of origin, being
So let me,
like Joe's, being like Joe's.
okay. So I'm not sure what's going on with the sharing, but it failed. So I think we can manage with this. So the first two again were pretty obvious. So I'd like to go to lessons 3 and 4. I'll read them. Once you learn to be comfortable with one group that is different from you, it is natural to apply this attitude to other groups that you encounter later in life. And lesson 4, a corollary to this. If as a child you learn from your family and schools to be biased against some groups, it is natural to become xenophobic and be bigoted against other groups. So any comments on either of those? Okay.
I don't have a hard time believing that. I think that's a truism.
Okay, right. So these are pretty obvious maybe, but that's okay. They jumped out at me as I was doing this.
Joe, I'm curious about people who were brought up in biased homes and went beyond it or overcame it, or
Sure. It happens.
I think it does happen. I mean, I don't think it's the rule. I agree with
Right.
what you're saying.
Right,
But I think there's a lot to be learned from people who grew up in conditions that were less than optimum and got insight.
Okay, agreed. So, and then I say lessons 1, 2, and 3, which are really about individual racism. Even if you were raised properly, you still will end up clueless about the realities of institutional racism unless you were taught it. So again, that's lesson number 5. And these two, I think, these are kind of deductions. I think I've read it as well, but if you are raised to resist bigotry, then you will likely be more open to learning about it and accepting the reality of institutional racism and its impact. Corollary to this, if you learn to be a bigot as a child, then you will likely not be open to learning about or acknowledging the impact of institutional racism. And again, I can say that most of my friends who I occasionally do stuff with, and if it gets into politics and if it gets into things like policing, they tend to be right away defending the police and don't even want to hear about the possibility of the other side of the story because it's just too inconsistent with their worldview. So those are my lessons. Maybe they're pretty obvious. Again, I will send them out to you all too. That's a 1-pager. So maybe now, yeah, go ahead.
So I was listening to what you were saying, how you were brought up. So I didn't have any of that in my household. And I was thinking about how I came up throughout my whole school, from elementary through high school. And in this particular section of Middletown, New Jersey, there was 135 Black single home family owned homes. And we just kind of all got along. This whole time frame right now is bringing to mind some of the things that I didn't experience coming up. And it's very surprising. It wasn't talked about in my household. My mother came from Peekskill, New York. It was not talked about in her household, and she lived in an Italian neighborhood. So some of it is very eye-opening to hear it because it wasn't taught. And, you know, I was born in 59. I graduated in 77. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lynn?
Yeah. History of the Unitarian Universalists here in Lincroft, there was, I guess it would be redlining, where a home, where property would be, or a rental would be available to a white couple, but not to a black couple. And members of our congregation, that was before, just before I got there. I think that would have been in Roshan and Ellen's day. They could tell us more about that. But they tested. They would go out and test. Oh yes, you can have this. This is available to you for white couples, but not to black. And that law did finally change, fair housing. But one of the things happened is we did have a few black people. We do, and one woman for several years came and helped us sing. She said, you don't know how to sing. So she was grateful for that work. And Etta, she really helped us sing. So I at least got to hear her. So I'm glad that Gwen didn't have to put up with that.
So people talk about redlining and I guess I don't understand it quite as much. My niece was explaining it to me she lives in Aberdeen, and the section that she lives in, I guess she lives on I don't know. Anyway, she lives on one side of 36 and blacks live on the other side. She said that was redlining, and then down in Willingboro. Coming from where I come from, and there were so many black families here, has anybody heard of any redlining of a whole area? Like
Tinton Falls, I think, was where they were testing, but I don't know about Middletown.
You might be able to look it up. There's a database that I found that actually has, redlining from different places. So you might be able to look it up, and it sort of confirmed a suspicion.
Okay.
Now, Patty had her hand up, and now Diane has her hand up.
And Stevie. Okay.
Okay.
You want to go first, Diane? Go ahead.
Unmute.
You're still on mute.
Okay. Everybody can Google Levittown, Long Island, and because this is coming up, the redlining and all of these things, and they talk about Levittown. They also talk about Donald Trump's father and developers that had explicitly in their contract large real estate developments that explicitly, somehow or the other, they were forbade integration, and that, so I know that when I grew up, when I first moved in, I bought the townhouse in Middletown in '88, but I first moved to Old Bridge in '84, and my grandmother was still alive. And when she got there, it was a townhouse development by Ernston Road. And when she got there and she saw that everybody was white, her eyes got so big, and she said, and my children were little, 5 and 6, and she said, "They let you live here?" And we laughed. But see, again, when you talk about the unspokenness, I thought that was a story. What do you mean they let me live here? I pay rent to live here. But she didn't then go into anything that would educate me as her grandchild about, the fact that Black people were not always allowed to live in a development or that kind of thing. So it swings both ways in terms of families, not wanting to say things, particularly that were painful things, that were historical things that they, I don't know about, I don't see all African-American families, but I know my family didn't, I would have been better served to deal. I would have been better served if my family had been more forthcoming about the reality of a lot of things, like when we were laughing, of course they let us live here. you know, that would have been a teachable moment for me. That's it.
Satya?
Hi. Okay, well, first, Joe, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation and for your courage to talk about all your experiences with all of us. That was really powerful, and I'm very grateful. And so what I wanted to talk about was two things. It really struck me were everyone's childhood experiences with racism. And so I wanted to talk about how I, as a brown person, was born and raised in predominantly white communities, and I am the daughter of two immigrant doctors. So we kind of lived both the privileged and the racist lives.
Great.
So growing up, all I remember was going to school, having a very diverse group of kids as my friends and my classmates, and I would have a lot of friends, but their parents were kind of the ones who were not very nice to me sometimes. A lot of the white kids' parents were not nice. So when I would go over for play dates and stuff like that in either elementary school or middle school, sometimes my parents would have to bear the brunt of the racist parents who would welcome us to their home. And that was really tough to see for me, just as a little child. And then in middle school, I then made another Indian friend, and we were both best friends throughout middle school and high school. And we had a lot of white friends, and because I lived in a predominantly white neighborhood, a lot of my friends who went to school with us lived right next to me. And so me and my friend Tara, the other Indian friend I had, would go to our friend's house, just our friend. And their parents wouldn't give us food. They wouldn't acknowledge us. They wouldn't look us in the eye. They would specifically name everybody in the room except for us. And it was so blatant and yet so mundane that it was crazy to be raised in a culture and in a liberal culture and society, as in Princeton, New Jersey, that, was so diverse in some ways, but how blatant that racism was. And then, other times it was very, very not blatant. We would go to a store, me and Tara, we would go to a store in Princeton. If you guys have been in downtown Princeton, it's very posh and all those stores are really expensive, but that's where we would hang out as kids. So we would just go into the store and people would follow us around. And we were like, why are you following us around? Like, this is so annoying. And we were just little kids, so we really didn't know. So sometimes I would buy something at the store just to make them understand that you're being a racist and I can actually afford stuff, or my parents can afford this stuff. So you guys shouldn't be judging us like this. So it's really interesting to hear everybody's childhood experiences with racism and how they either experienced it or saw it happening, because I felt both sides, and it was very, very, very odd. But then the second point I wanted to make was that I never really learned about institutional racism until college, and that's awful. Again, Princeton is a very liberal town and a pretty good education system. And then I went to private school in high school, still didn't learn about institutional racism until college. So again, I really appreciate that point about you have to, learn about these kinds of things.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Patty, I think, was next.
I wanted to say, I apologize. I meant to send out the email notice about our next library program, which will be this Wednesday. We're talking about, you know, the race conversation. Let's talk about race. Where have we been and where are we now? So I did finally just send it out. I think what tonight's conversation is prompting in me is how, as important as it is to understand the roots of racism, how our upbringings color what we think, inform our belief system, we have to, and we do have to educate ourselves now on institutional racism. It will not be taught to us in our school. It will not be taught to our children right now. So we have to do that, and we have to open our hearts and have empathy for what's happening to real people right now, and work on action items that we can enact in our own lives right now. There is no time to
it's
lose.
past 8:30. Oops, sorry.
What did the
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, the couple. Okay, I thought you were done, Patty. I'm sorry, but Joe had asked me to remind him when we pass 8:30. So, so just wanted to do that. Sorry, didn't want to cut you off. I thought you were done. So please continue
Diane,
and finish.
I think Diane is unmuted. We're here. It's Diane. Somebody is unmuted.
George, I guess
So
George.
sorry.
Can George be next?
Okay, can you guys hear me? Sorry, I'm late. I think Joe, maybe Liz, you guys remember when I discussed my story when I joined the council, okay? I actually came here from Greece. I was 11 years old, and I came to Asbury Park. I spoke no English at all. I went to my first class. I was the only white kid in my class. So I was brought up with all my best friends and everything, you know, being black kids, you know, playing soccer with them and everything, which is a good thing and a bad thing. And I'll explain to you why the bad thing. The good thing is because they see how my daughters, how, you know, I don't treat black people, you know, they're equal to me. Okay, everybody, and my daughters are for Black Lives Matter, but sometimes, you know, when you have that, it's also a bad thing that woke me up about, you know, when the George Floyd murder, because I get a phone call, I get a text message, because I'm also the youth director of our church, and Mickey and Jair are two Haitian black kids that were in my youth group. Now they're all grown up, they're in the city, and they text me and they said, "Oh, Mr. Mutis, do you still love us?" I was like, I said, "Oh my God, is this kid about to commit suicide or something?" So I freaked out. So I called him up. I said, "Mickey, what's going on? You know what, are you all right?" He says, "Well, Mr. Mutis, I haven't heard from you with everything that happened to George Floyd, you know, to talk to me." I said, "I'm so sorry." I said, what's going on?" He goes, "Well, you know, how we're treated as black people." And he goes, when I got my license, 17 years old, my mom said, "Oh, Mickey and Jair, make sure," because they're twins, "make sure, you know, when you drive your car, make sure you put your registration and your insurance card on your visor, not on your, not inside your glove box or everything, because if you go reach for it, a cop, you know, if they stop you, can shoot you." And you know something? I never thought of anything like that. So it was like a shocker to me. And then they're a part of our youth. We have a young adult group that I discussed with Joe, and we had a meeting with the young adults, and we actually have about, you know, 20 some kids. And we discussed that, and they actually took the time and effort to put together a program that is going to be given. We're going to give it to our Sunday school teachers at our church to teach about racism to the young kids. Because I'll never forget, one of our priests, I'll never forget, he goes to me, "Guys, you know where our kids are, right?" And everybody said, "What? The future, right?" Everybody would say the future. He said, no. He said, the young kids are our present, because he goes, if you have no present, there's no future. So he goes, how we teach our kids right now is going to make a huge difference later on in life. And also our young adults, like I was telling Joe, is they're going to put out these programs also to send them to like high schools to teach about racism as the young adult group, because that's so important, you know. But thank God, I mean, that a lot of our young adults, like my daughters, they're in their late 20s, you know, they're so for Black Lives Matter. Okay, so thank God, you know, that we have these young adults that are going to make a difference. They're pushing it, and it's very important for us as older generation to also help them and guide them and also push them to make a big difference. And the big difference will start if we start, you know, teaching our younger kids. Because if we teach them, as they get older, they'll make the change like our kids have made the change.
Guess we have time for maybe one more question, then we'll have very brief announcements, and then we'll have an opportunity to check out, especially if somebody hasn't spoken yet. So any last question? Okay, so maybe we'll do quick announcements. Liz, do you want to make some announcements? Mute.
Unmute.
We're looking forward to our annual meeting on September 21st, 7 p.m. on Zoom. And tell your friends, guests are invited. Let me know who they are, their email, so I can email the Zoom information. And we're thrilled. Ellen Chada is going to do her slide presentation with a 400 years history of African American history. And assisting her with the question and answer time are Georgette and Diane and Esmond. So very happy that they're going to be doing that. And then Joe, you want to mention the Shanti on October 3rd?
October 3rd, Saturday, time to be determined. The good news is we have a speaker, Kerwin Webb, who's the president of the NAACP of Greater Red Bank area, and he's a excellent speaker. A number of us have heard him, and he's got a great attitude, and I think he's really excited to be connecting to the Mama Center and to Mosaic. So I think he'll be a good partner going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And then, do you want to say anything about the projects?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. And we launched 2 projects. Thank you, Joe. He's the champion of the Get Out the Vote project. Has already sent out the information. Many people are involved, and that's just great. And Esmond is the champion for the for-profit prison project. And so we appreciate both your leadership, and we'll launch these 2 projects. That does not preclude or eliminate anything else on the list. It just means we're starting with those 2, and then we'll see. We'll go from there.
Right.
So thank you all for your participation.
Right. So if anybody has something in the list that they want to see happen, feel free to send out an email and try to generate some interest. And certainly if you're willing to be the one to get it started, that increases the probability we'll just plain go do that without the need to kind of have a huge prioritization process, which, you know, we still may do. But so far we got 2 things launched in a bottom-up way, and that seems to be working. So no limit on that. Any other announcements that anybody wants to make that would be really brief? So I will, so again, the recording will be, the link I'll send out in a few days. I'll send out a list of the short list of references. I'll send out the lessons learned. And I think that's it for me. So I think we have time for a checkout, which I guess Stevie's gonna monitor. So given that some people haven't spoken, maybe you could start with those who haven't spoken. It's optional to check out
I can handle it, Joe.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay. If you haven't spoke, what I would like to do is like we did last time, is this time we'll do alphabetical order and and give everybody a chance to say something. And if you didn't get a chance, you can have a little bit more time. But I think we have enough time. I think we have enough time for everybody. You do not have to say anything. That's feel free to opt out. Just say pass. You're not always in the mood to say something, so that's okay. I know that very well from my husband, Robert. Sometimes doesn't want to say anything. So what I'd like for everybody to, you could say something in addition to this, but what I'd like for everybody to do is say something I'm taking from our dialogue tonight. What is something you're taking away from the dialogue that has particular meaning to you, that's maybe a question you're leaving with? What's something that you're taking away from this dialogue? So maybe just take a minute to think about it, especially Raul, because he's going to be first, wherever you are. Okay, it's okay to be spontaneous too. Raul, can you say something you're taking away from this?
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't join you. I just caught you up around 8:40 or 8:30. I was at a Bhagavad Gita class, which starts at 7 and ended at 8:30. Anyway, I didn't hear Joe talk about the whole experience, but what I heard was Satya's mention about her experiences. And what is really interesting is that we come to know that after she comes home. When we go to drop her off, there's nothing we can see as something, they don't like or anything like that. When we go to pick her up, again, the same thing. It looks like everything went well. And then she would come home, and then this is the story we hear. So, but then again, we had both sides of it. The privilege of being a physician and, driving nice cars and living in a nice neighborhood. But, there is this undercurrent that was existing at the time. That's basically what I want to say, but I will listen to the tape and get more information that you've put out today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We probably have time for each person to make a statement like that. And I think it'll be very powerful to just hear what each one of us has to say. So Satya, what's something you're taking away from this conversation?
Sure. Something I'm definitely taking away was Joe, you nicely put like a progression of how like an unsegregated neighborhood, it leads to like unsegregated schools, which leads to just lack of diversity and lack of understanding, and then more importantly, lack of opportunity for those disenfranchised communities. And I thought that was very powerful. So thank you for that nice progression and like succinct idea.
Christine?
I continue to be amazed at things that I didn't realize were going on, like the GI Bill not being available to most Black veterans. Surprised the heck out of me when you said that tonight. My dad went to college on the GI Bill, and he was the first one in his family to do so. And again, it's like you said, the fish swimming in the water that doesn't know what the other fish are having to put up with. So it's important that we continue to remain aware and listen and be tuned in to the inequities in our country. Thank you for your presentation. And Satya, I'm really aghast at hearing about these other parents. I just want to give them a shake,
Yeah.
I really want to give them a slap, but I'm trying to sound more peaceful. It just drives me nuts when I hear those things.
Unbelievable.
Kids, there's no reason.
Okay, Calvin? Calvin here?
I guess so. I'm coming away with a much better appreciation for you and where you come from. You have such an incredibly rich experience, American experience, and still show how you get caught up in white privilege. I realized just in listening, my family probably practiced racism, but it was all under the guise of the church, so that it wasn't even identified as racism. It was just Protestant churches were always white wherever my family would go and whatever my family would do. So it was more of a religious segregation, because we did play with the black people, even though there were only 2 in our town and only 1 in our high school. But I just appreciated your doing this in such a thorough way and such a personal way. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Oh, Liz.
Hi.
Oh, Liz.
No, Liz.
Liz.
I really appreciated hearing both of your stories. They're very, very powerful. And I used to live in East Windsor, which is next to Princeton. But so the places sounded pretty familiar. And I definitely relate, because I grew up in Brooklyn, a different section, but also immigrant family. And I was reminded of my mother's story. She didn't tell me this when I was very young. She told me this later. And I knew she came from Germany alone at age 16. Her father was here and she wanted to spend time with her father. So she ended up on Ellis Island. And because she had trusted someone on the ship and given them her passport, she didn't have a passport. Of course, they stole it, right? So she's on Ellis Island, and she had to spend the night there. And she was in like a cell with bunk beds. And it was at that time her cellmate was a black woman, the first black she had ever seen. And she was terrified. She was terrified because of the circumstances, and she would have to spend time there until they could send a telegram to my grandfather to come get her. So, and to have some documentation or some paperwork. So her first experience of a black person was frightening, very frightening to her. And vivid memories of that.
Wow.
Thank you.
We're either, well, I'd like to suggest that we go over just by a little bit so that we get to hear from everybody. Is there anybody who cannot do that? It won't be a whole lot, but is that okay? Raise your hands or.
Sure.
Okay. So after Liz goes Lynn Dash, but then we also have Roshan and Lynn Dash, and then Roshan.
And I will try to be brief.
Okay, it's okay.
It's going back to my early congregational childhood, starting from when I was 2.5. Jesus loves everybody, and love your neighbor as yourself. And I never heard any exceptions on that. So with that kind of really being fundamental no matter what, it's really so frustrating and so hurting to see how people act like there's a lot of exceptions to that. And when we were in France, there was an old tile factory that was where Jewish people were sent, and then they were put on the train This was in the south of France. We just went there. It just opened a couple of years ago. My husband's Jewish. And the good people of Aix-en-Provence sent their neighbors to go there, including children. So I'm really dealing with just trying to remember that hopeful ideal. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you. Roshan, you're a C, not a D, but I'm getting close. You have to unmute.
Again.
Can we?
You unvideoed. Okay.
Hang on.
We can hear
Okay,
you.
well, somehow my video has stopped.
Okay,
So
we hear you.
We hear you.
Okay. I just want to thank everybody. I joined late. I joined actually when Lynn was talking. Some of my experiences are similar to what she was describing when I was working at Bell Labs. I have a long journey in the United States, starting off at Virginia Tech. I won't take much time at this point, but I do want to thank everybody for sharing what's on their mind. Thank you. Thank you very much.
What I'm thinking is we have some dialogues to follow up with, just to hear, more extensively different stories. Joe Donahue?
Yeah.
So thanks, Joe. I appreciate your time tonight. And as many of you know, I'm a UU, but I'm also a product of 16 years of Catholic education. And you talked about public education in your presentation tonight. And I'm still an avid and enthusiastic supporter of public education. Spent many years as an educator at the elementary school level. And I still believe it gives us an opportunity to teach about diversity, and it's probably a good forum for that. However, as an educator, I still realize there's a lot of work to do, even within public education, to talk about diversity and inclusivity. So the work is still out there for us educators to still put out and try to get something going that kids can be more understanding about different faiths, different racial groups, and so forth. So thanks again, Joe.
Alvinder?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I do.
I think mine's been a very interesting journey from growing up in England. It's undercurrents of racism. You feel it with, every little movement people make. They may not say as much, they may not shout and scream it, but every look can mean enough to make you want to go and jump off a cliff. So I came here in 1984 to work for AT&T Bell Labs, and I thought I had entered heaven. And I really would say that until 1999, I didn't really ever, I was on top of the world. I did not ever feel anything, but just, it's like I bloomed. And then I told you what happened once I left AT&T, came into lawyering, the builders, the real estate people. All of that was fine. And then, but it was still no big deal. It was no big deal. And then 9/11 happened. Islamophobia, that has not gone away. That gets worse day by day. And it's not just here in this country, it's everywhere. If that was not enough, Mr. Trump came into power. I actually, I'm sorry, but thought some of his policies were perhaps pretty good. And I'm not anti-Trump at all. But I can tell you what's happened just in the past 2 weeks. 1st of August, I took my car into Costco, just like always, just to have the tires balanced. I came out with chewing gum all over my car, which is 2 years old. Grease all over. Tires not inflated properly. Went back, was dealt with terribly. I'm the manager. It cannot happen here, so we don't need to talk any further. That kind of an attitude. Just today, I was in Whole Foods. I'm usually there twice a week, I think, normally. I was in line. They, put me in the cash line, go over there. I went and stood there. There was one guy in front of me. And the woman who directed me was still standing at the back. The guy disappeared because she sent him to another line or someone called him. I am putting my food on the cashier's, conveyor belt. And this woman who had directed me, who was standing there all the time, came. She said, "Were you here? Did you just jump in?" I said, "Excuse me? Did you just jump in?" We spent the next 3 minutes going back and forth. "You're the one who directed me. I'm here because you directed me. And, did you jump the line? Were you in line?" So I am going through a very strange phase where I have to now turn around and say to people that I was not denying that there's no racism here, or not much. And it's just that I did not experience it. I didn't see it. I did used to think people had, to some degree, a chip on their shoulder about it and were being victims and so on. That was their sort of way to be. But all I can say right now is that it's extremely helpful. I am not given to crying or being upset at this age after everything that one goes through. Very strong person. But right now, I am broken and shaken. But what I would say is, I'm sorry this is long, but I'm sort of cutting it short now. What we have to know, though, is this is not just here in America. This is all over the world, be it because people are nationalistic, be it people, it's religious. And here it just happens to be a byproduct of racism, slavery, whatever. But what I do walk away with from here and every day, and this is what I have to remind myself of, is that, we're all talking. All of us, every color, every religion. And I think that is a sign of mature people, a civil society, relatively so. And one of the guiding things in my life, whenever I felt I couldn't do anything, it was, Lincoln said, if you make up your mind to do something, it's already 50% done. That has guided me, and that has been a force with me. And so I go very hopeful from here, but I never thought I would say this because I'm not given to talking like this, but being able to share this with you seems to somehow help me go through it, lighten the burden. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you. Whew. Harry?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I found Joe's story to be very educational. I didn't know that Brooklyn was so much segregated at the time he was growing up, that he was the only non-Jewish student in the class. I had some of the experiences similar to Joe's in terms of Bell Labs because I was on the Area 10 Affirmative Action Committee, and we used to meet the vice president and give him our recommendations on how to improve the working conditions. Thank you.
Mary Carol, I think I skipped you. Mary Carol,
I was wondering if maybe you had somehow knew my maiden name and was going to use my maiden name. First of all, I just like Joe.
I just need new glasses. I ordered some today.
Joe, I really enjoyed your presentation today, and I also enjoyed listening to what everyone else has had to say. You know, this has just highlighted to me the tremendous power of hearing people's personal stories, and how wonderful it is to be with a group of people that are willing to share their vulnerability, you know, by telling their personal stories, both the positives and the parts that really hurt. Just want to say two other things very briefly. I had forgotten his name, Joe, but it was Mr. Harvey. And I took the same workshop, and he was ferocious. And I will tell you a story about him some other time when there's more time. Also, I think that the affirmative action programs at Bell Labs were really significant. And I actually didn't come to realize how significant they were until I wound up, after leaving Bell Labs, consulting with other companies that did not have those kinds of programs in them. And it was easy just going in for, you know, 2 or 3 days at a time to tell that there was a real difference in the culture. But one of my first AA meetings, I think it was the second year I was at Bell Labs maybe, was the focus was Asian Americans. And I was rather stunned because the thrust of a lot of the dialogue seemed to be how to make Asian Americans more like us. Aggressive, assertive kind of people. You know, it's let's become more inclusive by making those people more like us, so they're rude just like we are all the time. And I'll just, you know, that was just really interesting to me, and I think that stood out more at that particular meeting than any of the others. Anyway, thank you all.
Mary Carol?
Yes.
This is Roshan.
Hi, Roshan.
Hi. As a Punjabi, I didn't need all that.
You are assertive enough.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We learn something every day.
Very important. Humor is very important.
You can tell the group did not really understand the diversity in the population.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go last so that I can keep on going. Esmet's not here. George, do you want to say something else? You gave your powerful story about Asbury Park. Was there something else you're taking away from this meeting?
Just the one thing, you know, like I said, like I was one of the few white kids in my class. I'll never forget, on the basketball team, I was the only white kid on the basketball team, okay? And how, like, I never felt discriminated ever as a white person. And also the kids, like, would support me. And I'll never forget, I think I told you guys a story once that we're in the basketball, and we couldn't practice at the school. We had to go practice down at the down on Springwood Avenue. Okay, back then we're talking about 1973. Okay, there was no white people like on Springwood Avenue in Asbury Park, and they said, and the coaches said, we got to go practice there. And I'll never forget Jerome. He gets up and he says, "Coach, man, you can't let George go. He's white. You know, unfortunately," he goes, "there's other, you know, people that don't like white people. You know, we got to protect George."
It's very powerful story.
You know, and how they protected me, okay? I never felt as a white person discriminated by black people. And I always tell my daughters and everything, I'm going to go the extra step. You know, I actually had a fight with a friend of mine who said something about a black person, you know, that we were playing soccer at one time. So, you know, it was a beautiful experience, me growing up as a white person with all black people all around me growing up. You know, I never felt discriminated ever, and I can't even imagine, you know, what they feel. You know, I know what other black kids, like my youth, you know, Jay or Mickey told me that we have no idea, and I'm sure some of the, people that are black here, they had to deal with.
All right, Nada.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. I think I really like, Joe, your story. I mean, you divided into many chapters, very, very educational. Thank you for that. Early on, you talked about the immigrants' families, focusing on education for the children, so the children sacrificing, so the children would rise up to the next generation and so forth. Why is it not seen in Black people? Or what are the obstacles? Are these the obstacles that you're talking about? Are there other obstacles in it? Or is there a motivation issue?
Whoa, that's a big, big question.
Yeah, I won't try to tackle that. I mean, I just won't.
Okay,
yeah, that's a big question. Let me say, because we can't get into this right now.
Right.
But I think that's a big question that's also a statement. And I think that's something to be tabled for another time.
All right, okay. Sorry if I may raise some issue.
No, that's okay. It's too hard to answer quickly, and I'm not prepared to personally, so that's all.
Okay.
And that's okay, Matt.
Yeah,
I mean, there's,
right.
I think that might be a bleep in a way, but I think we need to be able to be
Sure,
open with
right,
each other,
right.
trust each other, ask difficult questions of each other.
Exactly,
So I
exactly.
think that's
No need,
perfectly okay.
no need to apologize, but I'm also
need to
willing.
apologize.
I'm also willing to punt.
Okay.
Thank you.
Joe, you're next. You want to say what you're leaving here?
Well, actually, I want to share an anecdote. I missed a piece of my story, which maybe it's nice to end on a positive note. Again, Bell
You're not the
Laboratories.
last one. You're not the last one, though. Do you want to?
Okay, that's fine. My piece will end on a positive note. So, in 1979, I managed a small group. It had at least one Christian, one Jew, one Hindu, one Chinese Buddhist, and probably the first fully veiled Muslim female who happened to be from Pakistan. I can add that we all got along fine. So diversity can work, and it's beautiful. It's actually beautiful to see when it's working. So.
Okay, Robert Smith.
Okay, Joe, you did a great job. This was really a terrific evening. And one metaphor that you mentioned, which I also feel like we can all identify this as homeowners so well, is to think about systemic racism as being like the old house that you now live in, where the walls are beginning to creak. And in my particular instance, when we have a downpour around here, I know that the basement's going to get wet. And I've learned to really ignore it and work around it, and I just don't think about it anymore. But there it is, and I may have to confront that sometime. So it's a great way to think, I think.
Georgette.
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, Joe, thanks so much for the insight, and thanks to everyone that worked for Bell Labs, or they came in with the institutional racism. I am a product of the banking industry from high school. I did not attend college before I started, and I worked 31 years in banking. Primarily for 21 of those years, I was the only Black female executive in that particular section of the company. I did experience some racism. However, I experienced some surprises as well. Most of my vendors or contact people, I would talk to them on the phone before I would meet them, and they would be in different cities throughout the country. So I used to travel quite a bit. And when I talked to them and introduced myself before they saw me face to face, when they did see me face to face, they were very surprised. because my dialect was very different coming from the shore of New Jersey. So they were very surprised that I was a Black female, because we were talking business and, we just needed to get work done. So I thank you very much for the insight. And the only thing I'll leave you guys with is, I told you about the neighborhood I came from, and maybe the reason that we didn't experience as much racism is because there was 135 Black families or more living on this hill that bought from every owner of every store in Atlantic Highlands that was white. So we were their income because that's where we shopped at.
Good point.
So, maybe there was the racism wasn't there because, we were their bread and butter. But I thank everybody.
Interesting insight.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Diane, we have Diane, then Annabelle. I haven't forgotten about you. Diane, Annabelle, Patty, and I have one sentence to say. So.
Okay, I'll be brief. I just want to say, as an addendum to my my narrative about when I moved into Flatbush, and that was just the first 2 days. At first, everybody was like cheering, "Yay, we got a new friend!" And then there was the rejection. But obviously, my mother didn't have a lease for 2 days. So as I lived there in the community, and people got to know me and say, "Hi, Diane," when I get off the bus and everything, I became friends with my neighbors. And it was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. But that's when I learned about this was an Orthodox, they were very, very strict, but that's when I started learning about bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and Rosh Hashanah, and I started actually engaging and learning about multiculturalism, because prior to that, my knowledge was really nil, other than basically my own community. So I just wanted to share that.
Okay, Annabelle, your turn.
Thank you. Hi, for everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Annabelle. Thank you for letting me sit in, and hello. Thank you for letting me sit in and listen. And thank you to everyone who has shared their stories and experiences, and thank you to Joe for your presentation. I guess one thing that, a lot of things that Joe said really stood out to me, and I was able to relate very quickly to things that I've been thinking about a lot. And one thing was when you mentioned the workshop that you went to where you and everyone else was kind of pressured to make the statement, "I am a racist," and kind of your reaction to that. And I'd agree with you that I think that is not an effective strategy, especially when it sounds like it was not explained to you why you were saying this. But I also don't think that his example of choosing the white girl over the Black girl is explaining why you should say you are a racist. I agree that that's probably not a good strategy. But it did make me think of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine a couple of months ago, where she's talking about people, mostly celebrities, apologizing for saying racist things or things that people were interpreting as being racist or behavior, and apologizing, and within the apology saying, "I'm not a racist." And how she felt like as soon as somebody says, "I'm not a racist," she kind of dismisses them because she feels as though that shows that they do not have an understanding of racism. Because how she sees it is that racism, and I think I'd agree with this, is that racism is so deeply rooted in our society that even though, as a few people mentioned it, I'm very thankful for being brought up in the family that I've been brought up in, where I've been taught to not only tolerate but celebrate everyone, And despite that, though, being brought up in such a racist society, I have been taught racism through my entire life. And therefore, I have what Joe mentioned earlier as implicit biases within me, right? And so I found it really interesting then, because I kind of then thought about, can I say I'm not racist if we all have racism within us? My friend would argue that growing up in America, I'd not be able to say I'm not racist because I have racism so deeply ingrained within me. So I just wanted to share that, I guess, that I think it's an interesting way to think of it. And I thought about it, and it's funny because when I talked to her about this, I thought, okay, it's hard, it's a difficult thing to accept. You can't just accept it. Obviously, you have to deconstruct that racism that you've been taught, as we're all trying to do. But I did kind of think about that. And so I think that just kind of wanted to share that in juxtaposition to what Joe expressed. Yeah, I don't have a way to end that off, but I'll end it there.
It's great. It's great. It's great. It's all great. Patty, is Patty with us? Patty.
She had to leave. She texted, she chatted that she had to leave.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'd love to hear what you had to say, but okay. I'm going to make this very short. I have a very powerful image that's that I'm enjoying as we're having this discussion about bringing up our children. And my son and daughter-in-law live in a very integrated neighborhood, not just racially, but I think in the information about their school system, it says that there are 40 different languages spoken in children's homes. And but there's an image that my daughter-in-law sent out on our Facebook. And I actually am a little concerned about this because I'm afraid that, anyway, I'm afraid it can be dangerous, but there's a picture of our adorable little 3-year-old standing in front of a sign that they put in front of their house saying, Black Lives Matter. And it just really, really is an image that I think about all the time because like there's this cute little girl and she has neighbors that are Black and anyway, it just makes me happy. And I want to, I don't know if Joe, if you want to say a closing thing, and we've got 21 minutes, but I am so grateful. I know I've said this before. I know I've ended with saying that I love everybody, which I do. And Joe, your story is so powerful. This should go on the road all over the world, if not the country, if not Monmouth County. It's so powerful and so well put together. I don't think I could critique anything, but I'll think about it. It's just really, really, I could relate to things. I'm going to be thinking continuously for the next days and days and days. So, and I also want to say, who said it? One person just said there's nothing like telling our stories. And this is a way to, this is a real appreciation for all of us and our willingness and our ability to tell our stories.
Stevie, this is Roshan. Stevie?
Yeah?
This is Roshan. I just like, before you all leave, like to put out an alert. Black women carry double the stigma than the Black men, although Black men pay with their bodies. You should please all watch how Kamala Harris is treated, both in the newspapers and in the campaign. Already a lot of ugly stuff is being thrown at her. And you should be all aware of that.
Very good point. Very, very, very important.
Okay, thank you.
So let me just close by, again, inviting other folks. If we think stories are effective, I would love to share a virtual table with like 2 other of you and have 3 stories. I would shorten mine, of course. So give that a thought. Now that you've heard a story, you have a model to think about. Second thought, the Asbury Park Press put out an article kind of praising their diversity. And, you know, there's a lot in the article of things have changed in a positive way. I was wondering if this story could be turned into a series of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. So give that a thought. I have a friend who used to work at the press. I might ask him his opinion. So that might be another way to do this. I really appreciate everybody's
Okay.
patience with me, and I thank you for the support. This was really an interesting. I mean, I personally learned a lot from this. So again, if that wasn't obvious, I mean,
Thank you, Joe.
I learned a lot. The best way to learn is to try to teach.
That's right.
So that's kind of, you know, and again, I'll be doing this in October for the Presbyterian church community around here, and recruit some others for that. So, you know, so think about whether this should be a public program and if other people want to join me on it. So give that some thought. And again, thank you. If you have any feedback on how I can make it better, feel free to let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Pleasant dreams.
Bye.